Hello friends, it's Josh Rose here. I want to show you a concept. Let's call it a sketch for a build for 3.15. This is going to be using a new skill called Voltaxic Burst that you're seeing here. You charge up and then this spell after 2.5 seconds is cast in a nova around you. It does chaos and lightning damage and it causes enemies to explode when they die, dealing 6% of their health. It's not a chance to explode, it's a 100% chance to explode. We all know corpse explosion like that is very good for clearing currently in Path of Exile, but I don't want to run into packs like this and wait for this thing to explode. So I thought I would try to do it on a cast on crit setup using a unique item called Astral Projector, which makes it so that Nova skills will cast where you're attacking rather than around your character. So you can trigger this Voltaxic Burst in the middle of big packs of enemies instead of having to run up to them and triggering it around yourself. All right, let's take a look at the build. Currently we're using Shock Nova as a placeholder for Voltaxic Burst. We use a Voltaxic Rift to convert the rest of the lightning damage from Voltaxic Burst into chaos damage. So Voltaxic Burst is 100% chaos damage, but with a Voltaxic Rift we can still shock with chaos damage, and it gives us a lot of increased efficiency of our shocks. Just doing some basic numbers, we should be able to do 14-15% shocks on Cirrus. And we also use an Astral Projector, which gives us the ability for our Voltaxic Burst to happen in the middle of packs far away from us. And let's take a look at the skill itself now. So we're going to use Barrage. That's going to give us 5 projectiles on every attack to allow for a lot more crits, which means a lot more procs of our Voltaxic Burst. Shock Nova has pretty similar numbers to Voltaxic Burst, by the way. So I think we'll see similar numbers once Path of Building is updated and has Voltaxic Burst in here. But these numbers are not correct here. So let's look at some notes. So basically this is each time we crit and get a Voltaxic Burst, it should do somewhere around this number of damage. And we should easily be able to get 6 of those per second, which is about as much as you can do without any cooldown reduction or without the default, without the awakened version of cast on crit. So by default, you can get about 6 spells in per second. And that should be something like this number here. Now we could also opt to trigger 2 spells, which means we would have to lose a little bit of average hit damage, but add in another spell, which would actually probably be Shock Nova along with Voltaxic Burst, those two together. And that number would end up looking something like this, a little bit better, 1.3 million. I subtracted some damage because Shock Nova will not be 100% chaos. It will only be 60% chaos. And so it won't scale as well with things like Wither stacks and that sort of thing. And then we also have an Azanath's Chant, which can also trigger a socketed spell when you attack with a bow. We're going to be attacking a lot. You can get about 3 of these, I think, a second. Let's look at what it says. Trigger rate 2.68. So that's something like another 350k, 360k DPS. So all this combined, if you're running this setup, we should be able to get around 1.6 million, that sort of thing. Now this is just kind of random gear. Some of it's good, some of it's not. But that's an idea of what kind of damage we could potentially do with this skill. Now the big question to answer, and really the big problem, the thing that is really going to kill us from this patch, is the fact that we now have to pay. We now have to pay for all of these triggered spells. They used to be free. When you triggered a spell, you didn't pay any cost for it. Well, we'll have to pay for the Azanaths, and we'll have to pay for anything we trigger in our cast on crit setup, which means that if we're trying to do this, Voltaxic Burst and Shock Nova plus another Voltaxic Burst in the Azanaths, we're going to have to pay like 350 mana per second if we're consistently attacking and managing to trigger all of these. And by the way, I need to say, it takes some careful tuning with our barrage, the number of projectiles we have, our attack speed, to get all this to line up properly, because we don't want to hit faster than 0.17, because if we hit our projectile 0.16 apart, then that second projectile is not going to trigger anything, right? So we have to kind of tune this, but just consider that right now with barrage, 2.67 attacks per second, 5 projectiles per attack, we have somewhere around 13 projectiles per second, which means we have enough projectiles and attack speed to trigger 2 sets of spells. They each have their own cooldown. So you can trigger 2 sets of spells, and we have enough projectiles and attack speed to do that, but it's going to take some fine tuning to get that just right, and I haven't done that yet. But anyways, that's going to cost, if we opt for this setup here, that's going to cost around 350 mana per second, and that is a lot. So the way that I've found that probably makes the most sense to deal with that is to use Eldritch Battery, Zealot's Oath, and Vitality. That means we spend Energy Shield instead of mana to cast spells, and Zealot's Oath makes it so that all of our life regen is applied to Energy Shield as regen instead. So that ends up just getting us to the point where we now have 253 regen per second. We can leech 80 per second, and we have a recharge of 83 per second, and that will get us up over that 350 or so that we would need to be triggering all that stuff. The question is it worth the opportunity cost? You have to pay another 5 points to get Zealot's Oath, and that could be 5 points spent in damage elsewhere that maybe would make the difference between triggering 1 spell or 2, right? So I'll have to continue to examine that. One idea was also to use kineticism, which makes it so that your attack projectiles will always knock enemies back. And that could be really useful with this build, keeping enemies off of us by shooting lots and lots of barrage projectiles, knocking them back always. Doesn't work on bosses generally. Well, some of them it does, but some of them it doesn't. But that could be really useful. And will that even be necessary to keep enemies inside the field of Voltaxic Burst, since it takes a little time before it goes off? So these are the things I need to discover when I play this build. Do we need to go Zealot's Oath? Is it worth the opportunity cost for all the extra damage it's going to give us? Do we need kineticism to keep enemies back and inside the Voltaxic Burst field? Will this knock them out of the Voltaxic Burst field? I don't know. Will it be necessary to use less duration so that Voltaxic Burst goes off much more quickly? It might be. I imagine if we're using Shock Nova and Voltaxic Burst, I have Arc as an extra placeholder, but I would use Shock Nova as my second spell probably. Then we would have front-loaded damage, and we probably wouldn't need Voltaxic Burst to be instant or much quicker. But so there's some refining to do, but there's an idea here, and I think it looks pretty decent, and it's really just figuring out the balance of the mana, the balance of the attack speed, and the number of projectiles, and whether or not we actually want to be triggering more stuff with an Azanath's Chant and triggering 2 spells and all that kind of stuff. So there's some stuff to figure out. I should point out corruption here is important because you leech 2% of your chaos damage as energy shield, and that's what gets us some of this ES leech for Eldritch Battery. I didn't really talk about the Ascendancy class, but Shadow helps us with our defenses, so we have some pretty good attack and spell dodge here, along with acro and phase acro. Life pool's a little low. We can play around with that. It's just some placeholder gear too. Some of it's good, some of it's terrible. In this version with Zealot's Oath, I threw in an All's Uprising. That way you can still use Wrath and reserve it for free, and then get the Vitality in and throw in a Herald of Thunder to help with some of the damage loss of having to use 5 points to get up here. So anyways, that's the idea. I hope you enjoy it. Give it a try if you want. If you have some thoughts on how to better sustain mana, or thoughts on some of the cast on crit triggering stuff that's going on, something I missed, let me know. If you try it, let me know. And hopefully I'll be playing this myself, and if I do, I'll update you in a couple of days on how it's going. Have fun in 3.15. See you guys later.